Afternoon, everyone. Oh, okay. So before I begin to present my case, I would like to tell all of you that I'm very grateful to be here. I thank each and everyone who made it possible for us to be here today. Now, today's motion states that in the aftermath of a genocide, forgiveness is more important than justice. But before I go on to present my arguments, I would like to define for you some of the key terms of this motion. Now, a genocide. What is a genocide? According to the UN Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of Genocide, 1948, genocide is the systematic killing of a large group of people based on their racial, religious, ethnic group with the intention of exterminating them. What is forgiveness? Forgiveness, according to Fred Luskin, a forgiveness expert, forgiveness is defined as a conscious, deliberate action to release feelings of resentment or vengeance towards a person or a group of people who has harmed you, regardless of whether or not they actually deserve your forgiveness. And justice is the process or result of using laws to fairly judge crimes and criminals. Now, before I proceed with this debate, I would like all of us to ask us a question. What is the main goal that a nation wants to achieve after a genocide? I'm not expecting you to answer, just want you to ask yourself that. Now, we as the affirmative team, we would suggest that the main goal that every society that has undergone a genocide should aspire to is to build a peace and to prevent the recurrence of genocide. Now, genocide researchers Gregory Stanton and Irving Staub suggest that a society that has undergone genocide is vulnerable to relapse within a generation if the conditions that led to genocide are not properly addressed. As the affirmative today, we would like to begin by acknowledging the importance of justice in holding killers accountable for making sure that the culture of impunity is ended. However, we do believe that forgiveness has a greater importance in helping the nation heal from its tragic past and stopping the recurrence of mass killings. Now, on to my first argument as to why we believe forgiveness is more important than justice. The first thing is forgiveness puts an end on revenge killings. In Cambodia, between the 1975 and 1978, a genocide was carried on. This genocide was led by Pol Pot, in which an estimated 1.5 to 3 million people died. In the Holocaust, also known as the Shoah genocide, in which Adolf Hitler's Nazi party and his collaborators killed about 6 million Jews, the victims included 1.5 million children and represented about 2/3 of the 9 million Jews who had resided in Europe. In the genocide against Tutsi in Rwanda, which was one of the most brutal acts of murder ever committed in human history, an estimated of 1 million Tutsis and some moderate Hutus were slaughtered over the course of 100 days from April 7th to July 1994. All the above-mentioned cases of genocide left millions of orphans and widows homeless, emotionally and mentally affected, financially weak, and physically injured. With all those harms inflicted to them, it is logical that the number one thing victims of genocide want to do is revenge. They need to inflict the same pain to the perpetrators as a way of easing the pain they feel, which is the reason why we believe that forgiveness is more important than justice to minimize the risk of revenge killings from happening. Now, a justice system, both retributive, which is a system of criminal justice based on the punishment of offenders rather than on rehabilitation, and another justice system, which is restorative, which is a theory of justice that emphasizes repairing the harm caused by criminal behavior, cannot change the victim's envy to take revenge, since we're talking about genocide crimes, which imply that the victim has lost those that are dear to them and those that no one and nothing can ever replace. After an atrocity like the genocide, victims are left with deep unhealed wounds. Unless the victims deliberately take the decision to release feelings of resentment or vengeance towards a person or group of people who has harmed them, which means forgiving them, they will not be able to move on. And if given the right circumstances and the ability to do so, they will be able to inflict more violence to the perpetrators group. Now, in a book that he called Why Forgive, Johann Christoph Arnold describes forgiveness as something humans need in order to be able to move on. The author comes to the conclusion that after a person has been wounded deeply, there is a need for an appeasement. To most of the cases, justice does not exactly take away all the pain, nor does it compensate for the victim's loss, because even after perpetrators have been locked up in jails, victims not feel peaceful until they have forgiven, until they themselves take a step forward to letting go of resentment and grudges. According to Irving Staub, who's a genocide scholar, in his work that he entitled The Root of Evil, one of the most important causes of genocide is unhealed wounds from past victimization. History shows us that over time, again, that victims tend to turn into perpetrators if they do not heal from their wounds. Now, the only way that we believe that they can heal from their wounds is to forgive, in order for them not to be vulnerable to committing violence anymore. Now, the second argument is that forgiveness restores social cohesion. After a genocide, whether we want it or not, life has to move on. And we have to reconstruct the country, reestablish systems that are needed, systems like education and healthcare. But we can't achieve this if people are not willing to unite and to work together. Therefore, our second priority in this debate after genocide should be to restore unity among people. And again, forgiveness is the number one the step forward to restoring unity. Now, here's the reasons why we believe that forgiveness does this. Forgiveness enables the victim to tolerate the oppressor's presence, and that those who come from the same group. We can take an example of Rwanda, whereby now the victims and the perpetrators are able to work together, despite the fact that they probably still hate each other, but they're able to work together in order to build the country's economy. And the second thing is, while justice focuses on either punishing the oppressor or getting them to pay for what they damaged, forgiveness works on health and the inner person of the victim. We believe that genocide is inherent to human, and genocide is very human. In order for it not to happen again, the victim has to be able to heal, and the victim has to be able to promote a spirit of tolerance, which is why we advocate that forgiveness in the aftermath of the genocide is better than any other form of justice. Thank you. Okay.
So before I start, I would like to thank everyone for being here today, and a special warm thanks to the IDebate Rwanda program and our competitors for making it out to discuss this issue with us today. Let's start. We negate resolve. In the aftermath of a genocide, forgiveness is more important than justice. We negate for two reasons. First, in the context of the Rwandan genocide, we argue that the main perpetrators of genocide is not the Hutus, but rather the perpetrators of genocide is actually European imperialism that's created the social, political, and economic conditions for genocides to take place. Therefore, we seek justice by demanding the EU to pay reparations to Africa in order to resolve the root causes of genocide. Second, in the context of Americas, we argue that Native Americans must seek out justice before forgiveness by demanding land reparations for the indigenous people. While the United States has apologized to the Native Americans for the history of genocide, we argue that these apologies are empty promises unless they are backed by material decolonization and the respect for indigenous sovereignty. And it is for these two reasons that we advocate for the aftermath of genocide. Justice is more important than forgiveness. Okay. Justice. We define justice as social justice. According to the article titled Towards a Decolonizing Prodigy, social justice recognizes that the forms of violence experienced and dominated by exploited groups are normalized and sanctioned by dominant ideologies and institutional arrangements, and we argue for the notion of social justice that sees dismantling. Imperialism abolishing its multiple forms of violence as preconditions to the existence of justice. Contention number one, Rwanda. Even though the genocide of Rwanda was from the Hutus, the main culprit for this problem is Belgium during the scramble of Africa. The Belgians resumed the German practice to utilizing elements of the Tutsis minority as the collaborators of choice. Racial segregation was implemented that ultimately sowed the seeds of horror in 1994. Belgian masters introduced a mandatory ID card system that formalized Hutus and Tutsis classifications for the first time. Framing the Rwandan genocide as a product of European imperialism policies allow us to hold Europe morally and legally accounted for. Gilbin 13. Post-genocide Rwanda, because of the violence they have suffered, was believed to be the result of colonial fabrication concerning the origins of relations in Twa, Tutsi, and Hutus identities. These unattainable colonial constructions need to be replaced with narrative based of tangible scientific evidence to aid recolonization and post-conflict nation buildings. In post-genocide Rwanda, by aiding the deconstruction of colonial constructed myths surrounding pre-colonial Twa, Tutsi, and Hutu identities, and the construction of new historical narratives that could be used in education. Okay. The EU should provide financial reparations to Africa as a method of transformative justice. Through Rwanda and the international community have valiantly pursued justice, financial compensation for the genocide survivors have still not been materialized. Can there be a genuine recolonization without financial reparation? The answer, in my opinion, is no. Reparation plays an important role in both mending the damage done by educating society. Considering both the imperial history of the West and the UN's failure to intervene and stop the conflict, we argue that the Western powers are morally responsible for providing reparations to the survivors of the Rwandan genocide. One would hope that after its failures of the UN will take a leading role in compensating survivors. Unfortunately, it has foreign shown interest in the criminal proceedings, ignoring financial reparations. Although it did establish the ICTR, it has avoided dealing with the subject of reparation. There is a lack of will to participate in the reparation process. The solution to this is to concentrate measures on a national level to encourage other international partners to participate in compensation endowment to improve the living conditions of the survivors. Contention number 2, the Americas. According to Dr. Gary Anderson, professor of history of University of Oklahoma, European colonization of Americas involved systematic genocide of indigenous people, wiping out 95% of the native population. The United States westward expansion required to force relocation and extermination of major tribes, resulting in the seizure of 1.5 billion acres of native land. The U.S. genocide of Native Americans is documented series of broken treaties, land theft, and massacres. Dr. Eve Truck, a member of Unigas Nation, a professor of critic race and indigenous studies at University of Toronto, emphasized that the settler colonialism is not an event. Settler colonialism is a structure. That is, we're not only living in the aftermath of colonialism and genocide, the colonization of land and genocide of the indigenous people is still happening today. Here we would like to introduce this term, slow genocide, to refer to policies that do not cause immediate death, but rather lead to slow and steady death of an annihilation of a group. So given the ongoing slow genocide experienced by the indigenous people in the Americas, we advocate that the justice must come before forgiveness, and justice must come in the form of land reparations for indigenous people. In the case of Native Americans in the United States, to prioritize forgiving over justice, to accept an apology in the United States without ever holding the United States morally and legally accountable to the Native American communities. Put simply, we cannot forgive someone who is truly not sorry. Instead, we prioritize justice by advocating for decolonization through land reparation to the indigenous people. So our solution to this case is that it's important that we need to be able to have justice before forgiveness. Our type of justice isn't putting people in cages or punishing them. Our type of justice is reparation towards the people who have been victims of these problems, and we need to have forgiveness after. Thank you.
Everyone, first of all, I would like to. Thank you very much, everyone. First of all, I would like to express my happiness and joy to be here. It's like my second time to speak somewhere where there is a president. I feel privileged. Thank you for being here, Mr. President. It is a crucial topic to discuss about genocide and exactly how forgiveness and justice, two important topics that should really be present in the aftermath of genocide. But the question now is, what comes first, or what helps the nation to really achieve its ultimate goal? My first speaker mentioned it, that we believe that the main goal of a nation that has gone through justice is to make sure that there is peace, and then to make sure that there is no signs or anything that can make genocide to happen again. But the question now remains is, how do we make sure that we make this happen? with justice or forgiveness. My fellow colleagues from the opposition, they suggest that we should do a transformative justice. But now, there is one thing that we should realize in here. If you want to have a transformative justice, it means that you're just going to give opportunities to perpetrators of genocide to change their mentality, to live a life whereby they feel less guilty. But how can you feel less guilty when you know that by the day you come back in the community, someone is still going to be hating you? How can you feel less guilty when you know that in the community, people have not forgiven your dues? Now, the question here remains is, we as the proposition, we do not deny that justice can do something, but what we are saying is that for any justice to happen, there has to be sense of forgiveness within the people, because forgiveness lays ground for justice to happen and achieve its ultimate goal. Now, they say that we should not forgive someone who is truly not sorry. How do you measure that someone is truly not sorry? How many mistakes did we make and our parents punish us, and we are just not ready to say sorry because we feel so guilty? There is that thing in a human that makes them that makes it so hard for someone to just come out and say sorry. Though it is something that everyone should do. But the question now here is, when you forgive someone, it's not all about that they deserve it. It's about even your inner peace as a victim. Because as we mentioned it with my speaker, she said that when you forgive, it means that you tolerate the presence of someone who has done harm to you to be in the society. And what does that do? It means that if you tolerate the presence of someone who has done harm to you in the society, it means that you're fine to work towards peace together. You're fine to even allow them to think about what they did, to realize that all their actions were really bad. Now, I want to talk about forgiveness as looking at the post-genocide generation. As my personal story, I was born on a genocide perpetrator. My father, my uncles contributed to the genocide. And on the other side, my mom lost aunties, lost uncles, and lost some of her close friends. But the question now remains, Kelia, who was born on a genocide survivor, how do you make sure that these two people live together if you're only focusing on a generation of perpetrators and a generation of survivors? The question here remains is, in our country now, 65% of the people are the post-genocide generation, people who are under the age of 24. Now, what this means is that we need to make sure that the two sides of the victims understand that whatever that happened, whatever that their parents did, they did not contribute to it, and they have to forgive each other for their parents' mistakes so that they can reconcile and make sure that the country does not go through a genocide again. So why am I saying this? I'm saying that, yes, we should provide justice, and we should make sure that justice is there. But the first thing to make sure that the transformative system or the transformative justice that they're suggesting doesn't feel like it's on the expense of the victims. Because what happens is, if you want to implement transformative justice, when victims still feel bad about the perpetrators, when victims still feel like they hate the perpetrators, when the victims still feel like there is that thing that really they should put the blame on all people, on all Hutus, on all Nazis, it means that we cannot achieve full peace as a nation. So the opposition need to realize that, yes, justice is necessary, but for justice to achieve its ultimate goal, people need to bring back the sense of humanity, the sense of forgiveness, which can help to achieve that. Now, going to my other argument that is actually going to help to refute one of the argument they said, that who should we blame for the genocide that it has happened? That we should blame the colonialists. A short story about Rwanda. Colonialists left in the 1962. Genocide happened in the 1994, which means that Rwandans had enough time for themselves whereby they could realize that actually before the genocide they were united, and then colonialists divided them. But they should realize that they didn't do it for their good. They should have realized that the colonialists didn't actually come to divide them for their good, so that they can unite again as a nation. Now, what I mean by this is that Rwandans, yes, We do not say that the Belgium did not introduce the cards, no. But again, Rwandan leaders stood up and continued the plan. Rwandan leaders stood up and bought machetes that were used to cut heads of people. Rwandan leaders supported the idea of killing. Rwandan leaders preached on radios how to kill people. In Germany, people in Germany took time to preach. So you cannot just say that you're going to ask for financial compensation of what happened in the genocide. Actually, which court is Rwanda going to use to make sure that they prosecute, or they take the law that can help them to I don't know how to say this, to make sure that the Belgium are punished for what they did. There is no court in place. And we should understand that we live in an unfair world whereby a small country like Rwanda does not have just a big bargaining power to just go and say that Belgium and France, you did this and this. We still have countries that are big nations that are still influencing some decisions in big courts that you're suggesting. So I don't know how you can go to report a person and you're still reporting to them about what they did. Now, another thing that we should understand is that transformative justice it minimizes the magnitude of genocide. Because what we need to understand is that genocide is not an event. It's not something that they just call people one day and they're like, hey, let's come and kill these people today. It is, if you were to learn about the genocide, a genocide scholar, Gogol Stanton, or even Alvin Stubb, they say that genocide, for it to happen, it has to go through 10 stages. Now, the question is, if you just assume that one way of justice is just going to help to make sure the country does not have genocide again, there we are doomed to have another genocide. Because as my first speaker said, that we are going to have genocide that is as a result of unhealed wounds. And how can people heal if they're not able to forgive, or if they're not able to be forgiven? Now, if we are able to understand that forgiveness lays a ground for any type of justice that they are claiming to have, then we can have a world where genocide can never happen again. Thank you.
I'm Gabe. It's a pleasure to be with you all today. Again, a special warm thanks, and it's great to be with our competitors and discussing this issue, because as we know, dialogue creates great change, and as well as to change policy. So going on to the crux of the argument. So the one thing we need to understand in terms of genocide. Obviously, as we know, Simon Wiesenthal once said that in a post-genocide of 2,000 years, it is known that power is in too many hands. So we have to debate the context of the background of genocide and why the ongoing trauma of genocide continues even after the murders and killings. One of the things that we had laid down in terms of what the imperialist context and how Belgium and other European powers set up the system in place. Yes, as the second speaker had mentioned, the affirmative is that we consider 1962 and 1994. These groundworks of imperialism set the stage for genocide and what decided the hate groups. Now, one of the things that was not discussed in the affirmative in terms of how forgiveness prevents the relapse. It was discussed in the first speech, but the relapse of genocide, because it's an ongoing trauma and wound that continues to perpetuate in terms of the system or socioeconomic status and political problems that is faced by the country. And one of the aspects of that is to think about the attitudes that were put in place. One of the things that my partner had mentioned in terms of what Belgium had done prior to World War I is to label the tribes and force them as to be considered races. Rwanda, prior to the context, was one culture and the people upon itself, but within identity politics, it was changed. So within that, with what we mean by why transformative justice is important and why reparations matter, is that in order to improve living conditions and provide a better background and framework that allows stability and protection by the law that is the justice, then we can proceed to forgiveness. Because the issue with forgiveness is there's no framework to ensure that the victim or perpetrator are not only within legal grounds, but to ensure the victim is not further victimized, and hence why the justice is needed. And they did concede to that as we go into the contention one. Now, in terms of what the example that was made within the Rwanda genocide and especially what happened in the Holocaust, we have to consider what comes first. Now, within the justice that was dealt within the perpetrators, is to understand that the victim does need solace and to understand the trauma that happens. And there's psychological trauma that continues even after the fact of those of the survivors. Now, what we mean by reparations within the European imperialistic powers or that of other social economic factors, for example, the structures or IMF and stuff like that, these resources that have taken from states like Rwanda or that of Africa, is to ensure that the reparations of the land of providing either direct access to civic leaders and direct funds to ensure that the nation proceeds and actually provides aid. What's important about this is that they had mentioned in their argument for the social cohesion that is needed to improve dialogue and structure in the country. In terms of social cohesion, one of the things that can be done is improving the socioeconomic status of the people at large. And one of the things that can be done is the forms for justice that is done through reparations, and why that matters in terms of the context of the debate. Now, this is crucial because when we think of the restorative justice that the affirmative had mentioned, is that it doesn't take into fact how do we ensure that dialogue is safe to ensure that the genocide does not relapse? When is it that we begin the process to actually forgive the transgressors and to ensure a safe discussion within that? How does that counteract between the interaction of that and to ensure that it doesn't relapse? So in that aspect, I turn the argument that it's important to hold accountable why justice is important and why racist attitudes in terms of what has been done in the prior context of genocide actually matters, and why it continues to damage the country at large. We had asked them in one of the questions in terms of, is genocide still continuing in terms of the aftermath? And they of course they did say that genocide, obviously people are not being murdered, but the after effects of what happens, context, and why it matters that we need to change the colonizing attitudes. One of the aspects that my partner had mentioned is in terms of C.L. Lewis, with the counterfeit lecturer in the U.S. History of Politics in York College, had mentioned what one Belgian doctor had said into the situation. And he wrote, the Tutsis have a distinct, reserved, courteous, elegant manner. The rest of the population, the Hutus, they are Negroes with Negro characteristics, and they are childish in nature, both timid and lazy, and often is not extremely dirty. And this is coming directly from a doctor, a person of considerate knowledge and that of academia. And these are just the attitudes that people have against countries, and they don't understand the prior context and why this is damaging rhetoric that further incites violence. That's why within the justice that is needed to provide policy change as well as social justice, and why it ensures that these discussions are being made, but to ensure that the policies that are set forth are designed to protect the individuals at large and to ensure that equality is there for the people. Now, one of the aspects of the Gilbey 13 evidence that we had provided that in a post-genocide Rwanda, by aiding the deconstruction of colonial constructed myths surrounding the pre-colonial Tutsis and Hutu identities and the construction of new historical narratives that can be used in education. And one of the things that is important to note is that in terms of reparations, what could be done for transformative justice is that reparations could help alleviate one of the biggest things. They had mentioned there is a need for health, education, and the structure for the actual country. This not only provides better access of aid, but it promotes dialogue and to ensure that the future of the next post-genocide generation actually provides well upon dialogue and removes the cycle of hate, which one of the things that is not being spoken for is in terms of the rhetoric. One of the things that Rwanda actually had done to ensure that the policies of hate was removed is to ensure that there is about 30% of women in parliament, to ensure there's a better stabilization and that the power is not within the men. And these are just one of the aspects that being done, but the policy change in terms of what justice can matter and why the discussion is prior forth into the prior questions of forgiveness shows why it's important to aspect and consider the psychological trauma of genocide, and why before we have the discussions of forgiveness, we need to set and hold the perpetrators accountable to ensure that there's safety for the victims so that the genocide does not relapse. And for those contentions, we hold that within the products of European imperialism and policies, it needs to be changed, and why the transformative justice comes first prior to the reformative justice that they had mentioned.
Peace in the people, and we make sure that we have a unity after a nation that has gone through the genocide. Now, for this debate should be judged on a side that has been able to provide a module that is going to really help any country that has gone through a genocide to make sure that those things that I mentioned above don't happen again. Now, I will start with what they propose. They propose a transformative justice, and they propose that we should require financial compensation to the countries that have really contributed to genocide happen again. But the question should be, how much money are you going to give to someone so that you can compensate to the person that they lost? How much money are you going to give to Kenya to make sure that all her aunties she lost, she does not feel bad about them anymore? Because now there is no measure of how much money is equivalent to the person you lost. Now, another thing they say that is the transformative justice that allows people to have conversations and allows people to really talk about different things. But now the question is, how do you allow people to have a conversation when within them they still have anger, they still have bitterness, they still have the pain of what happened, when they don't have the sense of forgiveness that allows them to come on the same table as Martin Luther King said, where they're not judged by any of their acts, but they're judged by the content of what they want the nation to become. Now, another thing is, we should judge this debate depending on all the facts that were given by the both sides. For us, we suggested that we need to look at the post-genocide generation, people like us who were born after the genocide. Because if genocide was to happen again because of our unhealed wounds, that genocide, the magnitude of it will be times 10 of the genocide that has happened before. Then another thing that we proposed as the proposition, we proposed that a country's mission after the genocide is to restore peace, and then that cannot happen without having proper forgiveness within the people. And then another thing that we showed is that there is no type of justice that can be there if people are not able to forgive, if people are not able to feel like they're comfortable to live in the same society with people who committed their crimes. Now, to conclude this debate, the opposition really gave good points, but we believe that for their points to really work, for their propositions to really operate in any nation after the genocide, forgiveness has to take the first step. Thank you very much.
Speech, and I would like to thank our opponents for providing a great discourse and discussion in terms of how the arguments were made, so thank you again. Now, in terms of the framework of the debate, I want you to think about the three following points that were made on the negative and why it matters that justice in terms of the timeline is more important to ensure peace and restoration of the country before we begin the dialogues of forgiveness. Number one, justice comes before forgiveness so that we can undo the structures that create environments of slow genocide. Hence why the rhetoric through social political situations are met, and why the justice and the immediate solution first before we begin the dialogues to ensure that there are safe discussions in which forgiveness within the dialogue of the victim and the perpetrator can actually be met. Second, prioritizing forgiveness over justice allows the perpetrators to be held morally and legally accountable, to which allows the perpetrator to continue committing genocide, which we go ahead and provides the conditions for it to relapse. Hence why there is no actual reinforcement, and to ensure that the forgiveness that is dealt first, it doesn't really guarantee that the victim itself will be protected from relapsing in genocide. Hence why justice is the safety net that is required to ensure that the dialogues of forgiveness is met afterwards, to ensure that those who are to be held accountable are actually held accountable. Third, this begs the question on who should we forgive? Should we develop critical pedagogy to create social transformation? Our method of decolonization, by actually providing reparations on the genocide, it not only provides a better situation for the state, but to ensure that the networks of imperializing state not only stops rhetoric of hate, but to ensure that it's better for the conditions of the post-trauma of genocide, which are continuing after effects, and how it affects the country at large in terms of poverty and other aspects, and why aid is important. Now, there was one aspect in terms of what reparation can be gained. There is no amount of value that can be placed on a human life. That is for sure. But to ensure that some aid and reparations should be made, one of the aspects of the arguments we have made in terms of why it's important to ensure that reparations were made to the Native Americans in terms of what the past treaties and genocides and massacres have been done to them, that it's a moral inclination to ensure that there is some justice that is provided based on prior massacres and genocides and the trauma that has been done to these people, because history often repeats itself, but we must prevent ourselves from allowing this to happen, and why it's important in terms of the discussion that justice is immediate, because we have, since the definition that they provided earlier since 1948 and the Nuremberg trials, we have brought to the world stage why the discussion of justice is important in terms of ensuring that within us as humanity, as we get along, to ensure that genocide is not an ongoing issue, and how we define it in terms of to ensure that no government or no people themselves systematically exterminate. Hence why within the arguments that we have made and presented to you all today, why we consider justice to be more important, because it provides a more transformative information for the populace to ensure before the prior dialogues of forgiveness.